All right, let's go. Number 10. The Mississippian Collapse. In 1250 CE, on a flat expanse of bottomland along the Mississippi River in what is now southern Illinois, there stood a city larger than London. Its name has been lost. The people who built it left no writing, no king lists, no chronicles of their dead. We call the place Cahokia, after a tribe that arrived in the region centuries after the city was already empty. At its height, Cahokia housed an estimated 20,000 people. It was the largest urban settlement north of Mexico, a metropolis of timber palisades, plazas, residential districts, and earthen mounds raised by the basket load over generations. At its center rose Monk's Mound, a flat-topped pyramid of packed earth 100 feet tall, its base covering more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. From its summit, the rulers of Cahokia could see the smoke of cooking fires stretching to the horizon in every direction. Farmers, traders, astronomers, artisans, priests. An entire civilization built without iron, without the wheel, without a written language we can read. By 1400 CE, the city was empty. No European had set foot in North America. Columbus would not sail for another 90 years. Whatever destroyed Cahokia, whatever drove 20,000 people to abandon the largest city on the continent, was already finished before the first Spanish ship reached the Caribbean. The mound builders walked away from their plazas, their granaries, their ancestral burials, and they did not return. Within decades, the wooden palisades rotted into the soil. The fields reverted to prairie. The city dissolved into archaeology. For most of the 20th century, the explanations leaned on the familiar. Drought, soil exhaustion, political fracture, deforestation of the surrounding hills. Some combination of environmental stress that pushed an agricultural civilization past the breaking point. These factors were almost certainly part of the story. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Skeletal remains from the late Mississippian period tell a different story than soil and pollen alone. Bioarchaeological analysis of burials from the final centuries of Cahokia and its satellite communities shows rising rates of tuberculosis, lesions on vertebrae, and ribs. Markers of chronic infectious disease appear with increasing frequency in the bones of the late population. Children and young adults, who should have been the demographic engine of the city, show stress lines, malnutrition signatures, and pathology consistent with a population fighting something it could not see. Cahokia was not just a city. It was the center of a trade network that extended from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Appalachian foothills to the eastern edge of the Great Plains. Copper from Lake Superior, shell from the Florida coast, obsidian from sources hundreds of miles distant. The same routes that carried prestige goods into the Great Mound Complex carried something else: pathogens, population density, and long-distance contact. The twin engines of every urban civilization in human history are also the twin engines of every pandemic. Cahokia had both, on a scale never before seen north of the Rio Grande. The truly unsettling aspect is the silence. There are no chronicles, no prayers carved into stone, no survivor accounts, no images of the dying, no names of the lost. Whatever swept through the wooden longhouses beneath Monk's Mound left no testimony except a falling birth rate, a rising death rate, and an abandoned skyline of earthen pyramids facing the sun. Monk's Mound still stands. The plazas where 20,000 people once lived are silent grass. The civilization that built them vanished before history arrived to record what it had been, taking the name of its own catastrophe with it into the soil. Number 9. The Hatusa tularemia outbreak. In the year 1715 BCE, in the rocky highlands of central Anatolia, scribes inside the fortified capital of the Hittite Empire pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay and recorded what may be the oldest pandemic in human history. The tablets, recovered from the archives of Hatusa, describe a sickness moving through the population and the livestock simultaneously. Skin ulcers, swollen lymph nodes, fevered animals collapsing in the fields, people dying alongside the donkeys that carried their grain. The scribes did not have a word for pathogen. They did not have a concept of bacteria. But they knew something was killing them, and they wrote it down. The disease was almost certainly tularemia. Modern researchers examining the symptom descriptions on the tablets, the ulcerated skin lesions, the lymphatic swellings, the cross-species infection between humans and pack animals, have identified the signature of Francisella tularensis, the bacterium that causes what would later be called rabbit fever. It is a disease that thrives in rodent populations and transmits to humans through contact, inhalation, or contaminated water. In the dense urban environment of Bronze Age Hatusa, with its stone-walled citadels and crowded grain stores and intermingled livestock pens, it would have found an ideal breeding ground. The death toll is unknowable. The Hittites kept no census, but the tablets describe the sickness as widespread and persistent, moving through the empire's heartland and resisting every ritual the priests could devise to drive it away. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. The Hatusa tablets do not only describe the outbreak, they describe what the Hittites did with it. According to the cuneiform records, during a period of conflict with the neighboring kingdom of Arzawa to the west, the Hittites drove infected donkeys across the border into Arzawan territory. The animals were sick. The animals were dying. And the Hittites understood, somehow, with no germ theory, no microscope, no scientific framework of any kind, that the sickness in those donkeys could be transferred to the people of Arzawa. The tablets describe mass donkey deaths in the enemy lands shortly after. The Arzawans, according to the Hittite records, fell ill. This is the earliest documented act of biological warfare in the human record. Roughly 3,700 years ago, in the Bronze Age highlands of Anatolia, a civilization with no scientific vocabulary for disease weaponized a pandemic. The implications are staggering. The standard narrative of human history treats germ theory as a 19th century discovery, a triumph of Pasteur and Koch and the microscope. Before that, the story goes, humans attributed sickness to bad air, displeased gods, imbalanced humors. They did not understand contagion. They did not understand transmission. They did not understand that a sick animal could carry an invisible killer across a border. The Hittites understood, not in molecular terms, not in language any modern epidemiologist would recognize, but operationally, functionally, lethally, they understood enough to use it as a weapon. They observed the pattern. They identified the vector. They deployed it against an enemy. And then they recorded the entire operation in clay for their gods and their kings, and, accidentally, for us. What makes the Hatusa outbreak particularly unsettling is what it implies about everything that came before it. Writing in Bronze Age Anatolia was barely a few centuries old when these tablets were inscribed. The understanding they document, the recognition that disease moves between bodies and across species, did not begin with the invention of cuneiform. It was already there. It had been there. For how long, in how many cultures, applied in how many forgotten wars, no one can say. The tablets remain in museum collections today, their wedge marks still legible after 37 centuries. The donkeys are dust. The Arzawans are gone. The pathogen that crossed the border with them sits in the soil of Anatolia, still, waiting, as it has waited the entire time. Number 8. The Bronze Age Aegean collapse and the disease that may have ended a literate world. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean ended. Not gradually, not in any single battle that historians can name, not through the slow decay that usually consumes empires. Within the span of perhaps 50 years, every major civilization from the Aegean to the Levant simultaneously fell apart. The Mycenaean palaces of mainland Greece burned. The Minoan remnants on Crete dissolved into silence. The Hittite Empire, the same political superpower whose plague prayers and weaponized donkeys we just examined, vanished from Anatolia entirely. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned in a single generation. The Late Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most catastrophic civilizational extinctions in human history, and to this day, no one can fully explain what caused it. The conventional explanation involves a tangle of factors. Drought conditions. Across the eastern Mediterranean, confirmed by pollen records and isotope analysis of cave formations. Invasions by the mysterious sea peoples, raiders whose origins remain debated. Internal rebellion, trade network failure, earthquake clusters along the Aegean fault systems. Each factor is documented. Each factor is real. Together, they offer a picture of a world under simultaneous stress from multiple directions. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Even combined, drought and invasion and earthquakes struggle to explain the speed and totality of the collapse. Civilizations have survived worse droughts. Empires have absorbed worse invasions. The Mycenaeans had weathered seismic events for centuries. Something accelerated the disintegration, something that left no monument and no inscription because the systems capable of recording it failed. At the same time, it was killing the people who would have written it down. A growing number of researchers now propose that pandemic disease was that hidden accelerant. Skeletal evidence from Mycenaean burial sites tells a disturbing story in the bones themselves. The remains from the final decades of the palace civilization show consistent markers of malnutrition, stunted growth, and the kind of porous bone lesions that develop when populations are subjected to sustained epidemic stress. These were not the skeletons of a healthy society dying suddenly from violence. These were the skeletons of a population already crumbling from within when the fire reached the palace gates. The candidate pathogens are familiar from earlier entries. Typhoid fever, the same disease now confirmed in the plague of Athens centuries later, would have thrived in the deteriorating sanitation of stressed urban centers. Plague itself, the Yersinia pestis bacterium already documented in Neolithic skeletons 2,000 years earlier, was circulating in Eurasian populations long before the Bronze Age ended. Drought concentrates populations around dwindling water sources. Concentrated populations amplify disease transmission. Disease transmission collapses the agricultural labor force. Collapsed agriculture invites raiders. Raiders accelerate flight, and flight accelerates contagion. The feedback loop, once initiated, would have been impossible to break. The archaeological closing argument is written in the ash. The palace at Mycenae, the citadel that gave its name to an entire civilization, burned and was never reoccupied. The palace at Pylos, home to the second largest archive of Linear B tablets ever discovered, burned and was never reoccupied. Across the Greek mainland, the great administrative centers of the Bronze Age suffered the same fate. They were not rebuilt. They were not resettled. The survivors did not return. What makes the Bronze Age collapse particularly haunting is what disappeared with the people. Linear B, the writing system that had recorded inventories, taxation, religious offerings, and royal decrees for generations, vanished. Not modified, not replaced, vanished. Greece would not produce another written script for over 400 years. An entire literate world fell into a dark age so complete that when the Greeks eventually relearned writing through Phoenician contact, they had forgotten that their own ancestors had ever possessed it. The implications are staggering. If pandemic disease was a primary driver of the late Bronze Age collapse, then a microorganism we cannot definitively identify ended Mediterranean literacy for 4 centuries. The Iliad and the Odyssey, eventually composed about this lost world, describe palaces and kings whose own scribal records had been forgotten by the time Homer sang their names. The collapse erased not just the civilizations, but the memory of how those civilizations had recorded themselves. Disease may have closed the books on an entire chapter of human achievement, and we are still reconstructing what was inside them. Number 7. The Hittite plague of Mursili. Around 1322 BCE, in the highland capital of Hatusa, in the heart of what is now central Turkey, a king died of something his physicians could not name. His name was Shuppiluliuma I, and at the moment of his death he was arguably the most powerful man on earth. He had broken the Mitanni. He had humbled Egypt. He had reshaped the political map of the Bronze Age Near East through 3 decades of relentless campaigning. Then, something invisible entered his body and killed him. His heir, Arnawanda II, ascended the throne and was dead within months. The same illness, the same invisible enemy. The Hittite Empire had been decapitated twice in less than a year by a disease that nobody in the ancient world could identify. We know about this pandemic because the surviving son, Mursili II, did something extraordinary. He wrote it down. The plague prayers of Mursili II, preserved on clay cuneiform tablets recovered from the royal archives of Hatusa, constitute one of the earliest sustained written accounts of an epidemic in human history. They are not medical documents. They are theological documents. Mursili, watching his empire die around him, addressed the gods directly and demanded to know what his people had done to deserve this. The prayers span 20 years. The plague lasted that long. The disease had arrived through war. Hittite forces had captured Egyptian prisoners during campaigns in Syria, and those prisoners were marched back into Anatolia in long columns of the conquered. Something traveled with them. Within months of their arrival, soldiers in Hittite garrisons began dying. Then civilians. Then the royal household. The pathogen modern researchers most often propose is tularemia, the so-called rabbit fever, a bacterial infection that produces skin ulcers, swollen lymph nodes, and prolonged fever. Others suggest an early pandemic influenza. The cuneiform descriptions are too sparse for a confident diagnosis. What is certain is that whatever entered Hatusa with those Egyptian prisoners proceeded to dismantle a superpower from the inside. And here is where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. The same clay tablets that record the prayers also record something else. Hittite military texts describe the practice of driving sacrificed rams, deliberately infected, into the territory of the neighboring Arzawan kingdom. Donkeys too, animals released across the border as carriers, sent to sicken enemy livestock and the people who depended on them. The Hittites had observed the pattern of contagion closely enough to weaponize it. Bronze Age scribes, working in cuneiform, were describing what we would now call biological warfare more than 3,000 years ago. They did not understand bacteria. They did not understand viruses. They understood that sickness moved between bodies, and they understood that a sick animal could be a weapon. The implications run in 2 directions at once. The Hittites were sophisticated enough to deploy plague as a military instrument. They were also incapable of stopping it once it had entered their own cities. The same empire that engineered biological attacks against its neighbors lost 2 kings in a single year to an illness it could neither name nor contain. The pandemic ground on for 2 decades. Mursili's prayers grew more desperate, more theological, more searching. He confessed sins he was not sure he had committed. He confessed sins his father had committed. He confessed sins committed before he was born. He was looking for any explanation that would make the dying stop. The dying did not stop. By the time the plague finally burned itself out in the Hittite population, the empire's manpower base had been hollowed. Its army was thinner. Its agricultural labor was thinner. Its administrative class was thinner. The state still stood, but the foundations had been eaten from beneath. When the late Bronze Age collapse arrived a century later, the Hittites were among the first great powers to disintegrate. Hatusa was burned and abandoned. The cuneiform archives went silent. The empire that had once dictated terms to pharaohs vanished from the political map of the ancient world. The plague did not destroy the Hittites by itself. It only made sure that when the larger catastrophe arrived, they were too weak to survive it. Number 6. The Plague of Athens, the sickness that ended a golden age. In 430 BC, in the second year of the Peloponnesian War, a disease arrived at the Athenian port of Piraeus and walked directly into the most sophisticated city in the ancient Mediterranean. Athens at that moment was at the height of its power. The Parthenon was barely a decade old. Sophocles was still writing tragedies. Socrates walked the agora questioning citizens about the nature of justice. Pericles, the statesman who had built the city's empire and its democracy, was directing a war strategy that depended on packing the entire rural population of Attica inside the city walls, while the Athenian fleet harassed the Spartan coast. The walls held. The population inside them did not. The sickness moved through the crowded refugee quarters with a speed that overwhelmed every system Athens had built. Within 4 years, between 75,000 and 100,000 Athenians were dead. That figure represents perhaps a quarter of the city's entire population, possibly more. Soldiers died in their armor. Physicians died treating patients. Priests died performing funeral rites. Pericles himself, the architect of Athenian greatness, contracted the disease in 429 BC and did not survive it. The man who had delivered the funeral oration for the war's first dead became one of its uncounted casualties, buried in a city that no longer had the manpower to bury its dead properly. We know what the dying looked like because Thucydides watched it happen and survived to write it down. The historian, himself infected and recovered, recorded the symptoms with the same clinical precision he applied to military campaigns. Violent fever erupting without warning in previously healthy people, throats and tongues turning bloody, breath becoming foul and unnatural, then convulsions, then the skin darkening, blackening, breaking out in pustules and ulcers as the disease moved through the body. Victims were consumed by an internal heat so extreme that some threw themselves into rainwater cisterns, trying to cool the burning. Most were dead within 7 to 9 days. Those who survived often emerged with fingers, toes, or eyes permanently destroyed by the illness. The city itself became a charnel ground. Thucydides described bodies piled in the streets where they had fallen. Temples that had served as shelters for the sick, filled with corpses no one would remove. Funeral pyres burned continuously, day and night, until the wood ran short, and grieving families resorted to throwing their dead onto pyres already lit by strangers, or simply abandoning the bodies where they lay. The stench, Thucydides wrote, hung over Athens like a second atmosphere, a smell that the wind could not carry away because the source kept multiplying faster than the air could dilute it. For 2,400 years, the identity of the pathogen remained an open question. Smallpox, typhus, measles, anthrax, hemorrhagic fever, and a dozen other candidates were proposed and defended in academic journals. The descriptions in Thucydides were detailed enough to rule certain diseases out, but not precise enough to confirm any single suspect. Then, in 2006, a team of researchers led by Manolis Papagrigorakis at the University of Athens published an analysis of dental pulp extracted from skeletons in a mass grave at the Kerameikos, the ancient burial ground just outside the city walls. The grave dated to the exact period of the plague. The bodies had been thrown in without the careful arrangement Athenian funeral rites demanded. The DNA recovered from inside their teeth pointed to Salmonella enterica cerevar typhi, typhoid fever. The disease that ended Athens was a bacterium that thrives in contaminated water and crowded conditions, exactly the environment Pericles had created by forcing the rural population behind the walls. The defensive strategy that was supposed to preserve Athenian power instead engineered the conditions for its destruction. What makes the plague of Athens particularly disturbing is how surgically it severed a civilization from its own future. Athens survived militarily for another 2 decades, but the city that emerged from the plague years was not the city that had entered them. The moral framework Thucydides described eroded with the death toll. Citizens stopped honoring the gods who had failed to protect them. They stopped saving for futures they no longer expected to see. They stopped respecting laws that no authority remained powerful enough to enforce. The confident, expansive Athens of Pericles never returned. The Golden Age ended not on a battlefield, but in a sick room, and the balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted permanently because a bacterium reached a port city in the summer of 430 BC. Number 5, the Antonine Plague, when Rome's legions carried death home from the east. In 165 CE, Roman soldiers returning from campaigns against the Parthian Empire in the Near East crossed back into imperial territory carrying something invisible in their baggage. They had sacked the city of Seleucia on the Tigris. They had marched through Mesopotamia. They had bled for the glory of co-emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. And somewhere in the heat of those eastern provinces, they had been infected by a pathogen that the Mediterranean world had never encountered before. By the time the legions reached Rome, the disease was already inside the empire's bloodstream. The roads that bound the provinces together, the same roads that made Rome the most efficient civilization the ancient world had ever produced, became arteries of contagion. Within months, the plague had reached Gaul. Within a year, it had crossed into Germania. Within a decade, it had touched every corner of an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. The disease was almost certainly smallpox. The descriptions left behind by the Greek physician Galen, court doctor to Marcus Aurelius, and one of the most meticulous medical writers of the ancient world, leave little room for alternative interpretation. He recorded victims developing high fever, then violent diarrhea, then black pustules erupting across the entire surface of the body. He described skin sloughing off in scabs, peeling away from the underlying flesh as if the body itself were being shed. He documented bloody coughing. He documented the rotting smell of the dying. Galen had seen battlefield wounds. He had treated gladiators. He had dissected bodies. And yet the disease he was describing in the imperial capital was something he had no framework to treat. The numbers defy comprehension. Modern estimates place the death toll between 5 and 10 million people across the empire's roughly 75 million inhabitants. Some provinces lost a quarter of their populations. Cities emptied. Villages disappeared from the tax rolls. And the Roman army, the instrument that held the entire structure together, was hollowed out from within. At the height of the outbreak, the legions are estimated to have lost up to a third of their effective strength. Emperor Lucius Verus himself, the co-ruler who had led the eastern campaigns, died in 169 CE, almost certainly of the plague he had helped bring home. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor whose meditations would become one of the most enduring texts of antiquity, may have died of the same disease 11 years later in a military camp on the Danube frontier, still fighting wars that the plague had made impossible to win. But here's where the standard narrative of Roman power falls apart. The Antonine Plague did not strike a declining empire. It struck Rome at the apex of its strength. The Pax Romana, the longest sustained period of peace and prosperity the Mediterranean world had ever known, was still in full force. Trade networks reached India and China. Aqueducts carried fresh water to 1 million inhabitants of the capital. The frontier legions held lines that had not been seriously breached in generations. And then, in a single decade, the foundation cracked. Tax revenues collapsed because the taxpayers were dead. Agricultural production fell because the farmers were dead. Military recruitment failed because the recruits were dead. The emperor was forced to sell imperial treasures at public auction to fund the wars on the Danube. He recruited slaves and gladiators into the legions. The empire that had projected absolute permanence began, for the first time, to feel its own mortality. What makes the Antonine plague particularly disturbing is the verdict that historians have rendered with the benefit of 2,000 years of hindsight. Many of them mark this pandemic, not the sack of Rome in 410, not the fall of the Western Empire in 476, but the years between 165 and 180 CE as the true beginning of Rome's long decline. The empire would survive for centuries more. It would produce great emperors and great works. It would even recover, demographically and militarily, in patches. But it would never again be what it had been before the soldiers came home from Mesopotamia. The strain that Galen documented in scabs and pustules had reached into the body of the largest organized civilization on Earth and weakened something that could not be rebuilt. The wound stayed open, and in less than a century, a second pestilence would arrive to find Rome already bleeding. Number 4, the plague of Cyprian, the rot that nearly ended Rome 2 centuries early. In the year 249, a sickness arrived in the Roman Empire that would not behave like any plague the empire had survived before. It did not announce itself at a frontier or burn through a single legion. It surfaced in Ethiopia according to ancient accounts, traveled north through Egypt, and within a decade had reached every province from Carthage to the Rhine. The only reason we know its scale in any detail is because a bishop in North Africa decided to write down what he was watching, kill his congregation. His name was Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, and the pandemic that would carry his name into history burned across the Mediterranean world for 13 years. Cyprian was not a physician. He was a churchman writing pastoral letters meant to console the dying and steady the living. But in attempting to find spiritual meaning in the suffering around him, he produced one of the most clinical and terrifying descriptions of mass death in the ancient record. He wrote of a continuous burning fever that consumed victims from within. He wrote of bowels loosened into bloody dissolution. He wrote of eyes set on fire with blood, of feet rotting at the extremities while the body still lived, of vomiting that would not stop, of throats ulcerated until speech failed. The infected, he wrote, walked the streets of Carthage looking like corpses that had not yet been told to lie down. Living corpses. The phrase appears more than once in the surviving texts, and it is the phrase that lingers. The numbers are difficult to verify and impossible to forget. At the peak of the outbreak, contemporary sources record that 5,000 people were dying per day in Rome alone, not across the empire, in a single city. The historian Zosimus, writing later, described entire provinces emptied of their populations. Villages were found with no one left to bury the dead. Fields went unharvested because there was no one to swing the scythe. Soldiers garrisoned at the frontiers died faster than recruits could be marched to replace them. The Emperor Hostilian was killed by the disease in 251. The Emperor Claudius II Gothicus was killed by it in 270. 2 emperors, swallowed by the same pestilence, separated by 20 years of unbroken contagion. What the disease actually was remains unresolved. Modern epidemiologists have proposed several candidates and reached no consensus. Some researchers, citing the bloody eyes and the catastrophic hemorrhagic symptoms, have suggested a viral hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola, possibly a filovirus that has since gone extinct or retreated into an animal reservoir we have not yet identified. Others have argued for a virulent strain of smallpox, distinct from the one that drove the Antonine plague a century earlier. Still others have proposed measles, or a pandemic influenza, or a pathogen that no longer exists in any recognizable form. No mass grave from the plague of Cyprian has yet yielded the genetic material needed to settle the question. The pathogen that killed 5,000 Romans a day for 13 years walked off the historical stage without leaving a name behind. But here's where the plague of Cyprian becomes something more than a medical mystery. The pandemic did not simply kill people. It dismantled the machinery of the Roman state. The depopulation of the army opened the frontiers to incursion. The collapse of agriculture triggered famine. The collapse of tax revenue triggered currency debasement so severe that the silver content of the denarius fell to almost nothing. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire cycled through more than 50 claimants to the imperial throne. Generals murdered emperors. Provinces seceded. The Gallic Empire broke away in the west. The Palmyrene Empire broke away in the east. For nearly 50 years, the Roman state existed in a condition of continuous, accelerating disintegration that historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century. And the plague of Cyprian sits at the beginning of that crisis like a match held to dry tinder. The truly disturbing aspect is the timing. Rome would not formally fall in the west for another 200 years. The plague of Cyprian very nearly closed the gap. It killed enough soldiers, enough farmers, enough administrators, and enough citizens to bring the empire to within sight of collapse 2 centuries before its actual end. That Rome survived it all was an accident of geography and a handful of capable emperors who managed, against staggering odds, to reassemble the fragments. The pandemic gave Rome its first real glimpse of its own death, and then it withdrew, leaving a weakened state to limp forward into a future it had not earned. Cyprian himself died in 258, executed during a religious persecution before the pandemic that bore his name had finished its work. The disease continued, without him, for another 4 years. And then, like the pathogen that caused it, the chronicle simply ends. Number 3. The Justinianic plague, when the first true pestilence came for the Roman world. In 541 CE, in the Egyptian port city of Pelusium, on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, dock workers began to die. Not in ones and twos, not in the slow attrition of ordinary sickness, but in numbers that overwhelmed the city's capacity to bury its dead within weeks. The historian Procopius of Caesarea, court chronicler to Emperor Justinian I, recorded the moment with the precision of a man who understood he was watching history change. From Pelusium, the pestilence moved along the grain ships, north into the Mediterranean, east into Persia, west into Italy and Gaul, and finally into the imperial capital itself. By the spring of 542, Constantinople was dying. What killed it was something the world had never identified before, but something the world would come to know intimately across the next 15 centuries. Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, the same organism that would, 800 years later, become the Black Death. The Justinianic plague is the first confirmed pandemic of Yersinia pestis in human history. In 2013, geneticists extracted bacterial DNA from the teeth of plague victims buried in 6th century cemeteries in Bavaria, southern Germany. The sequencing was definitive. The bacterium that ravaged the Byzantine Empire was the direct ancestor of the strain that would, in 1347, kill a third of Europe. The 2 great plague pandemics of the medieval and ancient worlds were not separate diseases. They were the same enemy returning. Procopius described the symptoms with a clinical horror that survives across the centuries. Sudden fever without obvious cause. Then the swellings. Black bubonic masses appearing in the armpits, in the groin, behind the ears, ranging from the size of lentils to the size of apples. The skin around them blackened as tissue died. Some victims fell into deep comas from which they never woke. Others descended into violent hallucinations, seeing phantoms in their bedrooms, believing strangers were attacking them, throwing themselves from windows to escape enemies that did not exist. Death came within days, sometimes within hours. The numbers defy comprehension. Modern estimates place the death toll between 25 and 50 million people across the first wave alone. In Constantinople, at the peak of the outbreak, contemporary accounts describe 5,000 deaths per day, then 10,000, then numbers. The chroniclers stopped attempting to count. Bodies accumulated faster than the city could process them. Imperial officials ordered massive pits dug across the Golden Horn. When the pits filled, towers along the city walls were stripped of their roofs and packed with corpses until the smell forced the practice to stop. Procopius wrote that the entire human race came near to being annihilated. The plague did not strike once and vanish. It returned in waves for the next 200 years, sweeping through the Mediterranean world in approximately 18 successive outbreaks, before finally subsiding around 750 CE. By the time it was done, demographic models suggest it may have killed half the population of the Byzantine Empire. Half. An entire civilization reduced by the work of a single bacterium passed from rats to fleas to humans across trade routes that had once carried grain and silk. But here's where the implications extend beyond the death toll into the architecture of history itself. Justinian I had inherited a fractured empire and a singular ambition. He intended to reunite the Roman world, to reconquer the western provinces lost to Germanic kingdoms a century earlier, to restore Rome itself to Roman rule. His generals, Belisarius and Narses, had already retaken North Africa from the Vandals, southern Spain from the Visigoths, and Italy from the Ostrogoths. The map was being redrawn. The dream was within reach. The plague ended it. Tax revenues collapsed as entire provinces emptied. Armies could not be raised because the population to fill them no longer existed. The reconquered territories, garrisoned by skeleton forces, slipped from imperial control within a generation. Justinian himself contracted the plague and survived, but the empire he had nearly rebuilt would never be whole again. The vision of a restored Roman world died in the mass graves of Constantinople. And then, a century later, when Arab armies under the early caliphs burst out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 630s and 640s, they encountered a Byzantine Empire and a Sassanid Persia that had been hollowed out by repeated plague cycles. The conquest of Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and Persia proceeded with a speed that has puzzled military historians ever since. The defenders were not absent. They were simply too few. The plague had cleared the ground. The world map of the modern Middle East, the linguistic geography of North Africa, the borders of European Christendom, the religions practiced by hundreds of millions of people today, all of it bears the fingerprints of a bacterium that lived in the gut of a flea in the 6th century. An empire that should have reunited fractured permanently. Conquests that should have been impossible became inevitable. The teeth of plague victims in a German cemetery hold the genetic signature of the organism that wrote the next 1,000 years of history. Procopius believed the pestilence had come from God. He was wrong about the source. He was not wrong about the scale. Number 2, the Cocoliztli epidemics, the forgotten Holocaust that emptied a continent. In 1576, a Spanish physician named Francisco Hernandez stood inside an indigenous village in central Mexico and tried to describe what he was seeing. He had trained in the finest medical traditions of 16th century Europe. He had served as personal physician to King Philip II. He had cataloged thousands of plants and animals in the New World with the meticulous precision of a Renaissance scholar. And yet the disease unfolding in front of him defied every framework he possessed. He wrote of high fevers that burned the body from within, tongues turned black and swollen, urine the color of dark ink, blood pouring from the eyes, the nose, the mouth, skin tinted a deep, sickly yellow. Patients died within 3 or 4 days, sometimes faster. Hernandez was watching one of the deadliest disease events in human history, and he had no name for it. The indigenous survivors did. They called it Cocoliztli. In Nahuatl, the word simply means pestilence. The Cocoliztli epidemics struck post-contact Mexico in two devastating waves, the first in 1545 and the second in 1576. Together, they killed an estimated 15 million people. The numbers are difficult to hold in the mind. Roughly 80% of Mexico's native population vanished across these two outbreaks. Entire villages emptied. Agricultural systems that had sustained civilizations for millennia collapsed because there was no one left to plant or harvest. Spanish chroniclers described traveling for days through landscapes of abandoned settlements where bodies lay unburied because the people who would have buried them were also dead. This was not smallpox. That distinction matters. Smallpox had already swept through Mesoamerica in 1520, riding ahead of Cortés and shattering the Aztec capacity to resist conquest. The Cocoliztli outbreaks came later, and in many regions they were deadlier than smallpox had been. A population that had already absorbed one demographic catastrophe was struck by a second that finished what the first had begun. For nearly 5 centuries, the identity of Cocoliztli remained one of the great unsolved mysteries of colonial medicine. Theories accumulated: hemorrhagic fever, measles complications, a novel arenavirus emerging from the rodent populations of the Mexican highlands. Without surviving pathogens to study, the answer seemed permanently out of reach. Then, in 2018, a team of researchers working with skeletons recovered from a burial ground in Oaxaca extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of Cocoliztli victims and identified the pathogen. The cause was Salmonella enterica paratyphi C, a strain of enteric fever that produces a slow, internal hemorrhaging, consistent with everything Hernandez had recorded 440 years earlier. The bacterium had been hiding in the molars of the dead all along, waiting for the technology to read it. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. Salmonella enterica paratyphi C was almost certainly not native to the Americas. The strain matches lineages found in medieval European burials. The most plausible vector of introduction is European livestock. The pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats that the Spanish brought across the Atlantic in the holds of their ships. Animals that arrived in a continent with no immunological history of the pathogens they carried. The conquistadors did not need to deploy biological weapons. Their livestock did the work for them, dispersing through indigenous communities along with the colonists themselves, contaminating water sources, contaminating soil, contaminating the agricultural systems that had fed Mesoamerica for thousands of years. The implications extend further than the death toll. The collapse of indigenous populations during the 16th century is one of the largest demographic events in recorded human history, and a substantial portion of it was driven not by violence, not by smallpox, but by a bacterium hitching a ride in the digestive tracts of farm animals. A civilization that had built cities larger than any in contemporary Europe, that had developed mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture independently of the Old World, was dismantled in part by an organism small enough that no one in the 16th century could have known it existed. What makes Cocoliztli particularly haunting is how recent the answer is. The skeletons in Oaxaca had been sitting in their burial ground for centuries. The bacterium was preserved in their teeth the entire time. The truth of what killed 15 million people was physically present, waiting to be read, while the cause was debated by historians and epidemiologists for generation after generation. The dead were always holding the answer. We simply could not hear them yet. Number 1. The Neolithic plague, the disease that was already killing us before history began. In 2015, a team of geneticists led by Simon Rasmussen at the Technical University of Denmark published findings in Cell that pushed the history of one of humanity's oldest killers into territory no one had expected. By extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from the teeth of skeletons buried across Eurasia, the team identified the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same organism responsible for the Black Death, in human remains dating to roughly 3000 BCE. Plague, the disease that medieval Europeans believed was divine punishment, the disease that emptied 14th century cities and rewrote the genetic profile of an entire continent, was already circulating among Stone Age humans 5,000 years ago. It had been killing us for 2 millennia before anyone invented writing to record it. The strain itself was not yet the killer it would become. Genetic analysis showed that this early Neolithic Yersinia pestis lacked the YMT gene, the specific genetic adaptation that allows the bacterium to colonize the gut of a flea and be transmitted through flea bites. The fleas, the rats, the medieval ecology of catastrophe, none of that infrastructure existed yet. This early plague spread the harder way, person to person, through respiratory droplets, through the air between living humans, breathing on each other in the close quarters of Neolithic settlements. It was a pneumonic disease before it was a bubonic one. And pneumonic plague, untreated, kills nearly everyone it infects within days. Then came the implications. The dating placed the emergence of Yersinia pestis in human populations at almost exactly the moment when something inexplicable was happening across the steppes of Eastern Europe. The Tripilia culture, centered in what is now Ukraine and Moldova, had built the largest settlements anywhere on Earth at that time. These were not villages. These were proto-cities, mega-settlements housing up to 15,000 people in concentric rings of timber and clay houses stretching across hundreds of hectares. They were the densest human populations the planet had ever seen. They were also, archaeologists had long noted, behaving strangely. The Tripilia mega-settlements were burned, not raided, not sacked, not destroyed by invaders and rebuilt by survivors. Burned deliberately by their own inhabitants, then either rebuilt on new ground or abandoned entirely. Excavations across dozens of sites reveal the same archaeological signature again and again. Thick ash layers blanketing the foundations, clay figurines fused and warped by heat so intense it vitrified the household objects left inside, entire towns reduced to scorched outlines, then walked away from. For over a century, archaeologists proposed explanations ranging from ritual renewal to climate stress to soil exhaustion. None of the explanations were satisfying. None accounted for the scale. But here's where the ancient DNA changes everything. The earliest known Yersinia pestis strains appear in human remains from precisely this region during precisely this period. The mega-settlements collapsed. The Tripilia culture, which had sustained itself for nearly 2,000 years, fragmented and dispersed. The largest concentrations of human beings on Earth at that time scattered into smaller, isolated communities. And the disease that would later be called the Black Death was loose in their bodies, carried on their breath, spreading most efficiently exactly where humans crowded most densely. The burnings begin to look less like ritual and more like containment. The abandonments begin to look less like migration and more like flight. What makes this entry the most disturbing on this list is not the death toll, which we will never know, but the timing. The Neolithic plague did not arrive at the end of a great civilization. It arrived at the beginning. It was present at the moment humans first attempted to live together at urban scale, and it may have ended that experiment before the experiment had a name. The dense settlements of Eastern Europe, the first cities humanity ever built, were dismantled by their own inhabitants, possibly because the price of density was a disease that killed everyone it touched. The Tripilia people did not leave us writing. They did not leave us kings, or laws, or recorded prayers. They left us ash layers and warped figurines, and a bacterium frozen in their teeth that would, 4,000 years later, kill half of medieval Europe. The Neolithic plague predates the Justinianic plague by 3,500 years. It predates the Black Death by 4,300 years. It predates the invention of the wheel in some reconstructions. It predates the pyramids by half a millennium. It was killing humans before humans had cities to lose. before they had writing to mourn the dead, before they had the concept of history within which to place a catastrophe. Every pandemic on this list, every named plague, every documented collapse, every entry counted down from 10, all of it is a footnote to this. Disease was already shaping us before we were watching. The architects of our civilizations were never only the kings and the farmers and the priests. They were also the organisms living quietly in the lungs of the dead, waiting for us to gather closely enough to spread. The skeletons are still in the ground. The bacterium is still in their teeth. And the question of how much of our prehistory it wrote remains, for now, unanswered. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.